It started like any other day. I was in the kitchen, brewing tea, the hum of suburban silence around me. My husband had grown more emotionally distant over the years, our conversations reduced to logistics, and our touches felt more like routine than romance. It wasn't bitterness between us, just a slow erosion, like waves gently pulling sand from beneath your feet. I wasn't expecting anyone when the doorbell rang. It was Eshen, my neighbor's 22-year-old son, back home from university for a few weeks. He had always been polite, even charming, but in a respectful way. That day, he was holding a book I'd recommended months ago, smiling sheepishly. "Thought you'd like to hear what I thought of it," he said. We sat in the living room, and I laughed more in that hour than I had in months. It wasn't flirtatious, at least not at first. He asked questions that felt sincere, listened closely, and spoke like someone who genuinely cared how I saw the world. When he sat next to me, closer than expected, I felt it, that unspoken energy, the pause in breath. I didn't move. I told myself it was innocent, that he was just being friendly, but as days passed, he kept coming over. Always with a reason, always respectful. Yet his eyes lingered longer, and mine began to respond. We started texting late into the night. At first, it was book quotes, then confessions. He told me he always felt drawn to older souls. I told him I felt invisible in my own home. Those weren't just texts. They were lifelines. Then came the moment that changed everything. I was sitting on the couch, one lazy afternoon, wearing my husband's shirt and old leggings. Eshen dropped by unexpectedly. He looked tired, emotionally drained. "Can I sit?" he asked. I nodded. He sat right next to me, our thighs almost touching. The silence was so loud I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. He looked at me and I looked back. No words, no touch, but in that gaze, it was as though we had crossed every line already. I remember whispering, "This isn't right," but not moving away. He didn't touch me, didn't kiss me. He simply said, "I know." And then he left that evening. My husband noticed I was unusually quiet. I couldn't meet his eyes. Over the next week, I tried to push Eshen out of my mind, but the messages continued. "I miss our talks," he wrote. "I think about you more than I should." And then, one night, I left my phone unattended in the living room. My husband picked it up to check the weather. One message popped up. "Eshen, I can still feel the moment we didn't touch." The fallout was immediate. My husband didn't yell, but his silence was louder than any argument. He asked me directly, "Did you cheat?" I said, "Not physically." He looked at me with eyes that had never seemed so distant. "That's worse," he replied. Now, weeks later, we're in therapy, trying to rebuild. I've cut off all contact with Eshen, but the truth is, I still think about him, not because of what might have happened, but because he reminded me of who I used to be before I faded in my own marriage. It began with the silence between her and her husband, a silence that didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't even ask questions anymore. It simply existed, stretching across dinner tables, between bedtime routines, through birthdays and weekends. She had stopped noticing the exact moment it all started. Perhaps it was after the second miscarriage, or maybe it was during one of his long business trips where he barely called. What she did notice, however, was how lonely she had become even while sharing a home with someone. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't abusive, but he was absent, and not in body but in spirit. They spoke, but it was only about bills, groceries, or who was picking up the dry cleaning. When she cried in the shower, she didn't expect him to hear. And when he came home late without explanation, she didn't ask, because apathy had replaced anger, and numbness had replaced hope. And then Eshen knocked on the door. He was her neighbor's son, just returned from university for the summer, a young man with a thoughtful demeanor and a quiet charm that reminded her of how attention once felt before it became a currency withheld. The first time they spoke, It was outside in the garden. He complimented her flowers. It wasn't flirtatious, just genuine. She smiled for the first time that week. The second time, he asked her if she'd read a certain author. She had. Their conversation flowed easily, and she felt the spark of being seen again. Not just noticed, but recognized. He listened to her, asked questions that weren't surface level. He laughed at her jokes, not politely, but in a way that showed he meant it. That was new, that was missing, and she began to notice how much she looked forward to those 5-minute chats on the sidewalk or at the mailbox, more than she looked forward to any conversation inside her home. When Eshin came by with the book she had once mentioned in passing, something shifted. She was surprised he even remembered. Her own husband hadn't remembered their anniversary last year. She invited him in, just for tea, just to talk. And yet, the atmosphere felt different. Safe, warm, but charged with something unspoken. When he complimented the way she spoke, the way she thought, she didn't dismiss it like she used to when younger men gave shallow praise. Because this wasn't shallow, it was attentive. It was like being reminded of the woman she used to be before she started dimming herself to survive emotional neglect. She felt guilt, but it wasn't sharp. It was more like a background hum, muffled by the overwhelming need to feel alive again. Every time Eshin smiled at her like she mattered, she felt the emotional void within her fill just a little. And every time her husband passed her without a glance, that same void widened. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, yet, but she also knew she was now in dangerous emotional territory, because hearts don't need touch to betray. They only need someone to listen. It was only a week after their tea and quiet conversation that Eshin returned. His visits had become more frequent, always under the guise of something casual, returning a book, asking about the recipe she'd once mentioned, or simply saying he needed some fresh air away from his crowded house. She began to anticipate the sound of his footsteps on the front path. Her heart would pick up pace, not in a flustered or panicked way, but like it was being reawakened from sleep. There was no clear boundary she could point to that had been crossed. They weren't sneaking around, they weren't touching, but something was changing, undeniably, quietly, and deeply. That day, the sky was gray and soft rain tapped against the windows. She was curled up on the couch with a blanket, the TV on low volume, more for company than interest. Eshin knocked once, and then opened the door a crack. "Is this a bad time?" he asked. She shook her head and smiled without even thinking. "Come in," she said, and he did. He stood awkwardly at first, dripping a bit from the rain, and then she motioned to the couch beside her. "You'll catch a cold standing there like that," she teased. He smiled and moved slowly, unsure, and sat down, not at the far end but beside her, not close enough to touch, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else. A hush, like something suspended between them, like both were aware of something fragile being held in their silence. The television flickered in the background, but neither of them was watching it. Then he exhaled slowly and said, "You seem sad today." She didn't respond right away. Her throat tightened, and she swallowed hard. "Some days are just heavier than others," she whispered. He turned his head slightly toward her, his expression soft. "You don't have to carry it all by yourself," he said. Those words, they undid her. No one had told her that in years, not her husband, not even her closest friends. She stared at the floor, biting her lip, her eyes threatening to well with tears. She didn't cry, but she felt the ache settle deeper in her chest. The kind of ache you feel when someone finally sees what you've been hiding. He didn't reach for her. He didn't move. But his presence felt closer than it had ever been. A glance passed between them, longer than usual, and for a heartbeat she wondered what would happen if she leaned in just slightly. But she didn't, and neither did he, and that made it worse, because restraint only emphasized what both of them were feeling. She could feel the tension hanging in the air like a wire strung too tight. The space between them was filled with everything unspoken: her unmet needs, his growing affection, their mutual confusion, and the guilt silently blooming in the corners of her chest. And then, just like that, he stood up and said, "I should go." She didn't stop him. She didn't move. But when the door closed behind him, the room felt cold again, as if he had taken the last trace of warmth with him.